Hello everyone, welcome to Blacktop Files. Tonight we bring you some of the most unsettling hunting encounters ever reported from the mountain ridges and hollows of Appalachia. For generations, men have walked these slopes with rifles and bows, tracking deer and bear through terrain that hasn't changed much since their grandfather's time. They know the game trails, the elevation changes, the way sound carries differently depending on which hollow you're in. They understand the difference between a buck scrape and a bear mark, between the crack of a branch under a hoof and the snap of deadfall settling. These are men who've spent thousands of hours in the woods, who can read a forest the way other people read a newspaper. They're not prone to panic and they don't spook easily. But every few seasons, something happens in those mountains that doesn't fit the pattern. Something that makes a man with 30 years of hunting experience walk back to his truck in the middle of the day and drive home without his gear. Something that makes him stop hunting a ridge he's walked his entire adult life, or avoid certain drainages even when the sign is good. The stories tonight come from hunters across the Appalachian Range, from the Smokies to the Blue Ridge to the Alleghenies. They're about moments when the familiar suddenly became wrong, when the woods these men thought they knew revealed something that shouldn't have been there. What makes these accounts particularly disturbing is how carefully these men try to explain what happened, using everything they know about wildlife, weather, and the mountains themselves. They consider every rational possibility before admitting that something didn't follow the rules. And when you hear what they encountered, you'll understand why some of them never went back to those particular spots, and why others changed the way they hunt entirely. If you find these accounts as unsettling as we do, make sure to subscribe to Blacktop Files and turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. We also encourage you to share your own experiences in the comments below. If you've encountered something in the Appalachian backcountry that you can't explain, we want to hear about it. Your story might become the basis for a future file. Now let's begin with the first account. The game warden kept asking me why I hadn't reported it right away, and I didn't have a good answer for him. I'd been hunting the ridges above Cades Cove for close to 20 years by then, ever since my father first took me up there when I was 16. I knew those slopes the way I knew the rooms in my own house. I knew which saddles the deer used to cross between drainages, where the thermal currents shifted at dawn, which oak groves dropped the heaviest acorns. I'd arrowed 3 good bucks from those mountains and helped drag out 2 others for friends who didn't know the terrain as well. The place made sense to me in a way that most things don't. I worked maintenance at a plant in Maryville during the week, swing shift mostly, which meant I had mornings free during bow season. My wife had stopped asking me about my hunting years before. She knew I'd be gone from 4 in the morning until noon most Saturdays and Sundays in October and November, and she'd gotten used to the routine. I'd make coffee in the dark, load my pack and bow in the truck, and drive the 40 minutes to the access road I'd been using for 2 decades. I parked in the same pull-off every time, a wide spot where the gravel met the tree line, just past the 3rd switchback on the Forest Service road. From there, it was a 1.5 mile hike up to the ridge I preferred, steep enough that my lungs burned for the first 20 minutes, but not so brutal that I arrived too winded to settle in. The morning it started, I was headed to a stand I'd hung 3 seasons earlier in a big red oak about 60 yards below the crest. The tree had good cover and overlooked a bench where deer liked to bed during the day before moving down to feed at dusk. I'd taken a decent 8-pointer from that stand 2 years back, and I'd seen plenty of does and younger bucks from it since. It was a solid setup, and I trusted it. The weather that morning was perfect for early November. Mid-30s, clear, almost no wind. I made the climb in the dark using the headlamp I'd had since my 20s, following a path I'd walked so many times I could have done it blind. I reached the tree about 40 minutes before legal shooting light and used my pull rope to haul up my bow and pack. I settled into the stand, clipped my safety harness, and waited for the sky to turn from black to deep blue to that pale gray that comes just before dawn. The woods around me started waking up slowly. I heard a barred owl calling from somewhere down the hollow, and a few crows started moving through the canopy above me. A gray squirrel worked its way along a branch about 20 feet to my left, stopping every few feet to scold something I couldn't see. Everything felt normal. Everything felt exactly the way it was supposed to. The light came up gradually, the way it always does in the mountains. Details emerged from the darkness. The texture of bark on the trees around me, the shapes of individual leaves on the forest floor, the contour of the land as it dropped away toward the drainage below. I could see about 40 yards in most directions by the time legal light arrived, and I started scanning for movement the way I always did, letting my eyes drift slowly across the terrain without focusing too hard on any one spot. Deer are motion-activated animals. If you stare at one place too long, you'll miss the flicker of an ear or the shift of a shoulder 50 feet away. I'd been in the stand for maybe an hour when I noticed the silence. It came on gradually, the way temperature drops before a storm. The crows had moved on, and the squirrels had settled down, which was normal enough. But there was something else missing. Something I couldn't quite identify at first. Then I realized I hadn't heard a single bird in at least 10 minutes. No chickadees, no nuthatches, no woodpeckers working the dead snags. The woods weren't just quiet. They were empty in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was probably a hawk or an owl, something that had moved into the area and spooked the smaller birds into silence. That happens sometimes. A Cooper's hawk will shut down an entire section of forest for 20 minutes while it hunts. But I hadn't seen anything, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stayed still, scanning the trees and the ground below, looking for whatever had caused the change. I didn't see anything unusual. No movement, no shapes that didn't belong, nothing that would explain why the birds had gone quiet. Then I heard the sound. It came from down the slope, maybe 70 or 80 yards below my stand, somewhere in the thick laurel that choked the lower part of the drainage. At first I thought it was a deer moving through the undergrowth. It had that quality, something pushing through vegetation, branches scraping, leaves rustling, but the rhythm was wrong. Deer move in a specific way, especially in heavy cover. They push forward, pause, push forward again. They test the ground with their front hooves, and they stop frequently to listen and scent the air. This sound didn't have those pauses. It was steady, almost mechanical, like something walking on 2 legs instead of 4. I tried to convince myself it was another hunter. Bow season in that part of the park was lightly used, especially on weekdays, but it wasn't impossible. Maybe someone else had decided to work the same ridge and was moving through the laurel to get to a different spot. But the sound didn't match that either. A person walking through dense mountain laurel makes a lot of noise, sure, but they also curse and grunt and adjust their gear. This was just movement, steady and deliberate, without any of the small human sounds that usually go with it. The sound moved parallel to the ridge, tracking from south to north, about 70 yards below me. I turned slowly in my stand to follow it, moving my head an inch at a time so I wouldn't create motion that might alert whatever was down there. I still couldn't see anything through the laurel. The vegetation was too thick, the shadows too deep. But I could track the sound as it moved, and I started to realize something that made my chest tighten. It was staying at exactly the same elevation. It wasn't climbing or descending. It was contouring the slope, maintaining a perfect line along the hillside in terrain where nothing moves, that way naturally. Deer don't walk contour lines through thick laurel. They either climb to the ridgeline or drop down to the drainage. They take the path of least resistance, which in that kind of cover means following game trails that switch back up and down the slope. This thing was doing something different. It was staying level, pushing straight through vegetation that should have forced it either uphill or down. And it was doing it without slowing down, without stopping, without making any of the pauses that an animal would make. I watched the laurel shake as the sound moved past my position and continued north. I kept my bow ready, not because I thought I was going to shoot at anything, but because holding it gave me something to focus on besides the way my heart was pounding in my ears. The sound moved for another minute or so, maybe covering another 40 yards, and then it stopped. Not gradually, the way a deer stops when it senses danger. It just cut off completely, right in the middle of a step. The silence that followed was absolute. No birds, no squirrels, no wind in the trees. I could hear my own breathing, and I made myself slow it down because I thought whatever was out there might hear it too. I stayed frozen in my stand for at least 5 minutes, maybe longer, waiting for the sound to start again or for something to move in the laurel below. Nothing happened. The forest stayed locked in that unnatural quiet. Then I heard it again, but this time it wasn't coming from the laurel. It was coming from directly behind me, on the uphill side of my tree, somewhere on the ridgeline itself. The same steady, pushing through vegetation sound, the same mechanical rhythm. But this time it was closer, maybe 30 yards away, moving along the crest of the ridge from west to east. I turned my head slowly, trying to see up the slope through the trees. My stand was positioned so I could watch the bench below, which meant my back was mostly to the ridgeline. I hadn't worried about it because nothing I wanted to see ever came from that direction. Deer moving along the ridge would be silhouetted against the sky, easy to spot, and they almost always dropped down onto the bench to feed or bed. But now something was up there, moving through cover I couldn't see into, and I couldn't turn far enough in my harness to get a clean look without making noise. The sound moved past my position, still maintaining that perfect lateral line along the ridge. I managed to twist far enough to see a section of the slope about 40 yards away. A gap in the trees where the canopy opened up, and I should have been able to see movement if anything large was there. I saw branches shaking in the undergrowth, saw a small dogwood tree sway as something pushed past it, but I never saw what was making it happen. The vegetation moved, the sound continued, and whatever was causing it stayed invisible. Then the sound stopped again, just as abruptly as before. This time I counted. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. Still nothing. No movement, no sound, nothing. The woods stayed locked in that same terrible silence. I started thinking about the climb down from my stand, about how exposed I'd be on the tree trunk, about how long it would take me to get my harness unclipped and my gear secured and my boots on the ground. I didn't like any of those thoughts. I stayed in the stand until almost 10 o'clock, long past the point where I would normally have climbed down and still hunted along the ridge, or moved to a different area. I kept thinking the birds would come back, that the normal sounds of the forest would resume, and I'd be able to convince myself I'd overreacted. But nothing changed. The woods stayed empty and silent, and every time I thought about climbing down, I'd remember that sound moving past me on both sides, and I'd decide to wait a little longer. When I finally did descend, I did it fast. I unclipped, grabbed my bow, and went down the tree in about 15 seconds, without bothering with half the safety protocols I normally used. I hit the ground, scanned the area around me, and started hiking back toward the truck at a pace that was just short of a run. I didn't stop to look for sign, didn't check the scrapes I usually monitored, didn't do any of the things I would normally do on the walk out. I just moved, keeping my head on a swivel and my hand near the bear spray I carried on my belt. I made it back to the truck without incident. The Forest Service road was empty, the same as always. I loaded my gear, drove back to Maryville, and tried to pretend the morning had been normal. I didn't mention it to my wife. I didn't call any of my hunting friends. I told myself it had probably been a bear, even though I knew bears don't move that way. Or maybe a hiker, even though no hiker would push through laurel like that when there were trails nearby. I told myself I'd go back the next weekend and everything would be fine. But I didn't go back the next weekend, or the one after that. I found reasons to hunt different areas, different ridges, different drainages. I told myself I was just trying new spots, that I wanted to scout some fresh territory. My wife noticed but didn't say anything. She just looked at me a little differently when I loaded the truck on Saturday mornings and drove in a different direction. 3 weeks later, I ran into a ranger I knew at a gas station near Townsend. He'd worked the Cades Cove area for 15 years, and we'd talked plenty of times about hunting regulations and access and where the elk were moving. I asked him, trying to keep it casual, whether anyone had reported anything strange on the ridges above the cove recently. He looked at me for a second, then asked which ridge. When I told him, he got quiet. Then he said they'd had 2 other hunters report something similar in the past month. Both of them had been in stands on that same slope. Both around dawn, both describing the same kind of sound moving through the cover without anything visible making it. He said the Park Service had sent a wildlife tech up there to look around, mostly to rule out a bear with an injury that might be causing abnormal behavior. They hadn't found anything. No tracks, no scat, no hair, no sign of any large animal moving through the areas where the hunters had reported the sounds. The tech had hiked the entire ridge twice, checking every section of laurel, every drainage, every possible route. He'd set up a few trail cameras just to document whatever might be using the area. 3 weeks later, when they pulled the cameras, there was nothing on them. No deer, no bear, no elk, nothing. The cameras were working fine. They'd captured wind-moving branches, birds landing on logs, even a couple of squirrels, but nothing large. Nothing that could account for what 3 different hunters had described. The ranger told me the Park Service's official position was that the hunters had probably heard separate incidents involving black bears, possibly the same individual, moving through the area multiple times. He said it like he was reading from a script, and when he was done, he looked at me and said he wouldn't hunt that ridge himself. He didn't elaborate. He just paid for his coffee and left. I went back to that ridge one more time 2 years later, in the middle of the day in July when I was doing some scouting for the upcoming bow season. I hiked up in full daylight with 2 friends, both guys I'd hunted with for years. We walked the entire slope, checked the stand I'd abandoned, looked for any sign that might explain what I'd heard. The woods were normal that day. Birds everywhere, squirrels. Even jumped a couple of does out of a bedding area. Everything looked the way it was supposed to look. But when we got back to the truck, one of my friends mentioned that he'd noticed something odd. There were no game trails in the laurel on the lower part of the slope. Deer trails run everywhere in those mountains. You can't walk 50 feet without crossing one. But in that specific section of drainage, below the elevation where I'd heard the first sound moving, there was nothing. The laurel was thick and undisturbed, like nothing had walked through it in years. I haven't hunted that ridge since. I still go to the Smokies during bow season, but I stick to areas I know are active, places where I see fresh sign and regular game movement. I tell people I'm hunting smarter now, focusing on higher percentage spots instead of wasting time on ridges that don't produce. That's true enough. But the real reason is I don't want to be in that stand again at dawn, listening to the woods go silent, waiting for that sound to start moving through the laurel below me. I don't want to hear something walk a perfect contour line through terrain. Nothing walks that way. And I don't want to twist around and see branches shaking with nothing there to shake them. There are thousands of ridges in the Smokies, and most of them hold deer. I don't need that particular one. And I don't need to know what moves through it in the early morning when the birds stop singing. The conversation with the guy in the parking lot at the check station happened 2 days before the incident, and I think about it a lot now. He was an older hunter, maybe in his 60s, loading a nice 8-pointer into the back of a pickup with West Virginia plates. I'd just finished checking my own deer, a small 6-point I'd taken from a ridge overlooking the Cranberry River, and I stopped to admire his buck. We got to talking the way hunters do, comparing notes on what we'd seen, where we'd been hunting, what the rut activity looked like. He mentioned he'd been hunting the Monongahela National Forest for 40 years, mostly the area around the Cranberry Wilderness, and he knew the drainages and ridges the way most people know their own neighborhoods. I told him I'd been hunting the area for about 5 years, ever since I'd moved to Elkins for a job with the Forest Service. I worked as a timber cruiser, which meant I spent a lot of time in the woods anyway, walking property lines and marking trees and collecting data for harvest plans. The job had taught me how to read terrain and navigate without trails, which made me a better hunter. I'd learned where the big timber was, where the clear cuts had grown back into thick cover, where the old logging roads led and which ones were still passable. I felt like I'd developed a pretty good understanding of how these mountains worked. The older hunter listened to me talk for a minute, then asked which specific ridge I'd taken my buck from. When I told him, he nodded slowly and said I should probably stick to that area. I asked what he meant, and he looked at me for a second like he was trying to decide whether to continue. Then he said there were certain drainages in the Cranberry backcountry where the deer didn't move right, where the sign didn't make sense, where things happened that didn't match up with what he'd learned in 4 decades of hunting these mountains. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push. I figured he was talking about hunting pressure, or maybe some old-timer superstition about certain hollows being unlucky. We said our goodbyes, and I drove home thinking about the shoulder work I needed to do on my buck before I could get it to the processor. 2 days later, I was back in the woods, this time hunting a drainage I hadn't tried before, about 3 miles north of where I'd taken the 6-point. I'd scouted the area earlier in the season and found good sign, rubs on saplings, a couple of scrapes near a creek crossing, tracks in the soft mud near a seep. It looked like a solid area, and I had a day off work, so I decided to give it a morning. I drove to the trailhead while it was still dark, parked next to a Forest Service gate, and hiked in about 2 miles, using a combination of old logging roads and game trails I'd marked on my GPS during the summer. I set up on the ground in a natural blind created by a fallen oak tree and a thick cluster of mountain laurel. The spot gave me a good view of a bench about 20 yards below my position and a clear, shooting lane along the hillside where I'd seen fresh rubs the week before. The morning was cold, low 20s, with just enough breeze to cover any small sounds I might make. I got settled in about 45 minutes before first light and started the waiting game. Legal shooting light came and went without any deer activity, which wasn't unusual. The rut was winding down and the deer were getting pressured from all the hunters in the area. I stayed patient, scanning the hillside and the drainage below, watching for movement. Around 8 o'clock, I heard something moving in the thick stuff above me, on the uphill side of my position. It sounded like a deer working through the laurel, probably heading down to the bench to bed for the day. I turned slowly, bringing my rifle up, trying to see through the vegetation. The sound moved closer, maybe 30 yards away now, still in the thick cover where I couldn't get a clean look. I caught glimpses of branches moving, heard the unmistakable sound of hooves on leaves, all the normal indicators of a deer. I waited for it to step into one of the small openings in the laurel where I'd have a shot, tracking the sound as it moved parallel to my position. The animal was moving slowly, browsing as it went, stopping every few feet, like deer do when they're not alarmed. Everything about it seemed normal. Then it changed direction. Instead of continuing along the hillside or dropping down to the bench like I expected, it started climbing straight up the slope, moving directly away from me. That struck me as odd because deer almost never climb in the middle of the morning during hunting season. They find a good spot on a bench or in a drainage and they bed down. They don't burn energy climbing when they're trying to rest. But I could hear this one moving uphill, steady and deliberate, pushing through laurel that got thicker the higher it went. I stayed in position and listened to the sound fade as the animal climbed. It took maybe 2 minutes before I couldn't hear it anymore. Then the woods went quiet again, just the normal background sounds of the forest. I relaxed a little, disappointed I hadn't gotten a shot, but not surprised. That's how hunting goes most of the time. You hear deer, you see sign, but you don't always connect. About 10 minutes later, I heard the sound again, but this time it was coming from below me, from the bottom of the drainage, maybe 60 yards away. Same rhythm, same pace, same sound of hooves on leaves, and something pushing through undergrowth. I turned to watch the area, bringing my rifle around slowly. The sound moved from west to east across the drainage, staying low, never climbing toward my position. I still couldn't see the animal. The cover was too thick, the laurel too dense, but I could track it by sound as it moved past me and continued east along the bottom of the hollow. Then it happened again. The sound started climbing, not toward me this time, but up the opposite slope, moving away from the drainage floor and into the steep terrain on the far side. I watched the area where I'd last heard it, waiting to see if the deer would circle back or skyline itself on the ridge above. It didn't. The sound just faded out as the animal climbed, getting fainter and fainter until I couldn't hear it anymore. I sat there trying to make sense of it. The timing bothered me. The first deer had climbed away from my position maybe 10 minutes earlier, moving up the slope on the near side of the drainage. This second one had moved through the bottom of the hollow and then climbed the far slope. If they were two different deer, the timing was strange. If it was the same deer, it would have had to come back down the near slope without me hearing it, cross the drainage floor, and start climbing again on the far side. That didn't make sense. Nothing about the terrain or the animal's behavior matched what I knew about whitetail movement patterns. I waited another 20 minutes, and then I heard it a third time. Same sound, same cadence. But now it was coming from directly behind me, from somewhere up on the ridge crest, maybe 40 yards away. I turned as far as I could without standing up, trying to see up the slope through the trees. The laurel was thinner near the top, and I had a partial view of the ridge line. I saw branches moving, saw a small hemlock shake as something pushed past it, but I never saw the animal itself. This time I didn't hear it climb away. The sound just stopped, right in the middle of the movement, as if someone had hit a pause button. 1 second, there was the clear sound of something moving through the forest. The next second, there was nothing. Not a gradual fade as the animal moved out of earshot. Just an instant cut to silence. I stayed frozen in my blind for at least a minute, listening as hard as I could, trying to pick up any indication of where it had gone. The forest was completely still. No birds, no squirrels, no wind in the trees. The temperature seemed to drop, and I noticed my breath was coming out in thick clouds that hung in the air instead of dissipating. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I had to consciously slow my breathing to keep the panic down. I started thinking through the possibilities. 3 separate deer moving through the same drainage in different directions, all within a half hour, all of them climbing away from the floor instead of bedding down. That was possible, but unlikely. Or 1 deer moving in a pattern that didn't make sense, somehow looping around me multiple times without me hearing it, on the approaches, climbing and descending terrain that should have taken much longer to cover. That was even less likely. Or something else, something I didn't want to think about, something that was using deer sounds to move through the forest in a way deer don't move. I decided to leave. I'd been hunting long enough to know when a spot felt wrong, when the normal rhythms of the Obours forest were disrupted in a way that went beyond just spooky deer or hunting pressure. I packed up my gear as quietly as I could, slung my rifle, and started working my way back toward the trail I'd used to hike in. I didn't hurry, but I didn't waste time either. I kept my head on a swivel, scanning the trees and the slopes around me, watching for movement. About halfway back to the truck, I found the tracks. They were in a muddy section of the trail where a spring crossed the path, clear and fresh in the soft ground. Deer tracks, definitely. Perfect hoofprints, the right size and shape, showing all the details you'd expect. The split between the 2 halves of the hoof, the small dimples from the dew claws, the depth that indicated a good-sized animal. But there was something wrong with them. It took me a second to figure out what it was, and when I did, I felt my stomach tighten. The tracks were too perfectly spaced. Every single print was exactly the same distance from the last one, like they'd been measured and placed deliberately. Deer don't walk that way. Their stride varies depending on the terrain and whether they're browsing or moving with purpose. These prints looked like something had stamped them into the mud using a template, each one identical to the last, following a straight line across the trail. I stood there staring at the tracks for maybe 30 seconds, trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. Maybe the deer had been walking at a very steady pace. Maybe the mud was just the right consistency to make the tracks look more uniform than they really were. Maybe I was seeing patterns that weren't actually there because I was already spooked. None of those explanations felt right, but I didn't have a better one. I stepped over the tracks and kept walking. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop again until I reached the truck. When I got there, I found another hunter standing by the Forest Service gate, loading gear into an SUV with Pennsylvania plates. He looked like he'd just come out of the woods himself. I asked him if he'd had any luck, and he shook his head. He said he'd been hunting a ridge about a mile south of where I'd been and hadn't seen anything. Then he asked me if I'd heard anything weird. I asked what he meant, and he said he'd heard what sounded like a deer moving through the laurel near his stand. But when he tried to track the sound, it seemed to come from 3 different directions in the span of about 10 minutes. He said he'd hunted these mountains for years and had never experienced anything like it. I told him I'd heard something similar. We looked at each other for a moment, and then he said he probably wasn't going to hunt that drainage again. I told him that made two of us. I talked to my supervisor at the Forest Service the following week, casually mentioning the area where I'd been hunting and asking if there had been any reports of unusual wildlife activity in that part of the Cranberry Bay country. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, then asked if I'd heard or seen something strange. When I described what had happened, he nodded slowly and said I wasn't the first person to report something like that. He said there had been at least 4 or 5 similar accounts over the past 3 years, all from hunters working that same drainage, all describing the same kind of deer sounds that moved in ways deer don't move. He said the Forest Service's official position was that the hunters were probably hearing multiple deer and misinterpreting their movements because of the way sound carries in those hollows. He said the steep terrain and the dense laurel can create acoustic effects that make it difficult to pinpoint the exact location of sounds. He said all of that, but then he mentioned that he personally avoided that drainage during hunting season, and he recommended I do the same. He didn't offer any additional explanation. He just left it there. I've hunted the Cranberry Wilderness probably a dozen times since then, but I've never gone back to that specific drainage. I tell myself it's because there are better spots, areas with more consistent deer movement and easier access. That's partly true, but the real reason is I don't want to sit in those woods again and hear something moving around me in 3 different directions, making perfect hoofprints in the mud, climbing slopes in the middle of the morning for no reason. I don't want to watch branches shake with something invisible moving through them, and I don't want to hear that sudden silence when the sound just stops. The old hunter at the check station was right. There are certain drainages in these mountains where things don't move the way they're supposed to. And once you figure out which ones those are, the smart thing to do is hunt somewhere else. They found the body 3 days after I came out of the woods, and when the state police interviewed me at my house in Bluefield, I told them everything I'd seen. The detective took notes but didn't react much. Just asked clarifying questions about times and locations and whether I'd touched anything or moved anything at the scene. I said no, I hadn't touched anything. I'd backed away the moment I understood what I was looking at, and I'd hiked out to my truck as fast as I could without running. He asked if I planned to go back to that area, and I told him I didn't. He wrote that down too. I'd been hunting the area around Beartown State Forest for about 7 years by that point, mostly public land in the high country near the wilderness boundary. I worked as an equipment operator for a coal company out of Welch, running dozers and excavators on reclamation sites, which meant I had a rotating schedule that gave me random days off during the week. I liked hunting on Tuesdays or Wednesdays, when most other people were at work. The pressure was lighter, and the deer moved more naturally, without weekend warriors pushing them around. That particular week, I had Wednesday and Thursday off, and the forecast looked good. Cold, clear, light wind. I loaded my gear Tuesday night and drove to a trailhead I'd been using for a few seasons. A small pull-off near an old forest road that had been gated off years ago. From there, it was about a 3-mile hike back to the area I wanted to hunt. A series of ridges and benches that held good numbers of deer and didn't see much pressure because of the distance from the road. I started hiking at 5 in the morning, using my headlamp to follow the overgrown forest road until it petered out into a footpath that climbed steadily toward the ridgeline. I knew the route well enough that I didn't need my GPS until the last half mile, where the trail disappeared completely and I had to navigate by terrain features. I'd set up a stand the previous season in a big oak tree on a finger ridge that overlooked a saddle, and I'd taken a decent buck from it. I was hoping to find the same kind of activity this year. I reached the stand about 40 minutes before first light and got settled in. The morning started normally enough. Barred owls calling back and forth across the hollow. A few crows moving through before the sun came up. Squirrels starting their routines once there was enough light to see by. I watched the saddle below me as the sky turned from black to gray, to that pale orange that comes right before the sun breaks the horizon. The woods looked the way they always looked at that time of year, bare hardwoods with just enough undergrowth to provide cover without blocking sight lines. I saw my first deer about an hour after first light, a doe picking her way along the far side of the saddle, feeding on acorns and moving slowly uphill. She looked relaxed, stopping every few steps to look around and listen before dropping her head to feed again. I watched her for about 10 minutes before she moved out of sight over the ridge. Good sign. If the does were moving naturally, it meant the bucks would be cruising soon, checking scrapes and looking for receptive females. The second deer came through about 30 minutes later. Another doe, smaller than the first one, using the same basic route along the saddle. I was starting to feel good about the setup. 2 deer in the first couple of hours, both moving naturally, both heading in a direction that suggested they were using the saddle as a travel corridor. I settled in for the long wait, knowing that this time of year you might sit for hours without seeing anything, and then have 3 bucks show up in the span of 15 minutes. Around 10 o'clock, I heard something moving in the drainage below my stand, down in the thick stuff where a small creek cut through a tangle of rhododendron and laurel. At first I thought it might be another deer, but the sound was different. Heavier, more deliberate, with a rhythm that suggested something bigger than a whitetail. I turned slowly to watch the area, bringing my rifle around, wondering if maybe a bear was moving through. We had black bears in the area, and they were still active this late in the year, fattening up before denning. The sound moved closer, working uphill through the rhododendron, breaking branches and pushing through the vegetation with a steady, consistent pace. I still couldn't see what was making it, but I could track its progress by the way the bushes shook, and the small saplings swayed as it moved past them. Then it stopped maybe 40 yards below my position, right at the edge of the rhododendron where the terrain opened up into the hardwoods. I waited, watching the spot where I expected to see the animal emerge. Nothing came out. The sound had stopped, but I hadn't heard it change direction or move away. It was just gone, like whatever had been making the noise had simply ceased to exist. I scanned the area carefully, looking for any sign of movement, any indication of what might be standing there just inside the edge of the thick stuff. I didn't see anything. I stayed alert for another 20 minutes, watching that spot, waiting for something to happen. The woods around me stayed normal. Birds calling, squirrels moving, a distant crow complaining about something in the next drainage over. Whatever I'd heard in the rhododendron didn't reappear, and eventually I started to relax. Probably a bear that had winded me and backed off quietly. That happens sometimes. Bears are smart, and they don't like surprises any more than we do. Around 11, I decided to climb down and still hunt along the ridgeline for a while. Maybe check some scrapes I'd found during the summer and see if they were getting any activity. I packed my gear, descended from the stand, and started working my way along the ridge, moving slowly and stopping every 20 or 30 yards to glass the surrounding terrain. The sun was out now, and the temperature had climbed into the low 40s. Good tracking weather, cold enough that the deer would be moving, but warm enough that I wouldn't freeze my hands off glassing with binoculars. I'd covered maybe a quarter mile when I found the drag mark. It crossed the ridgeline at an angle, coming up from the same drainage where I'd heard the sound earlier and continuing down the far slope toward another hollow. The mark was maybe 8 inches wide, a clear depression in the leaf litter that looked like something heavy had been pulled across the ground. I knelt down to examine it more closely. The drag mark was fresh, probably made that morning. The leaves inside it were disturbed and compressed, and in a few spots I could see bare soil where the leaves had been scraped away completely. But what caught my attention was the lack of tracks around it. Whatever had made the mark should have left footprints or hoofprints or some indication of what was doing the dragging. There was nothing. Just the mark itself, a smooth depression cutting across the ridge in a straight line. I stood up and followed the mark with my eyes as far as I could see it, trying to figure out what might have made it. The only thing that made sense was someone dragging a deer out of the woods after a successful hunt. But that didn't match what I was seeing. The mark was too narrow for a whole deer, and there were no boot prints anywhere nearby. If someone had been dragging a deer, there would be tracks. The hunter would have had to walk beside or behind the animal, and in this kind of terrain, on this kind of slope, those tracks would be obvious. I decided to follow it. I told myself I was just curious, that I wanted to understand what I was looking at, so I could explain it later, if it came up in conversation. But the truth was, I was already feeling uneasy, and some part of me thought that following the mark to its source might settle the question and let me get back to hunting without that nagging sense of wrongness in the back of my mind. The mark led down the far slope, angling through the hardwoods and dropping into the next hollow. I followed it for maybe 200 yards, watching it maintain that same consistent width and depth, never deviating, never showing any associated tracks. It crossed a small stream, continued up the far bank, and disappeared into a section of thick mountain laurel that choked the bottom of the drainage. I stopped at the edge of the laurel, looking at where the mark vanished into the vegetation. I really didn't want to follow it in there. Laurel that thick is miserable to navigate, and I'd be making a lot of noise pushing through it. But I'd come this far, and I wanted to know. I took a breath, checked my rifle to make sure a round was chambered, and started pushing into the laurel. It took me about 5 minutes to work through the thicket, moving slowly, watching where I placed my feet, keeping my rifle ready. The drag mark continued ahead of me, still visible in the leaf litter beneath the laurel branches. Then the vegetation opened up into a small clearing, maybe 15 feet across, where a couple of large trees had fallen years before and created a gap in the canopy. That's where I found it. The buck was lying on its side in the center of the clearing, a big-bodied animal with a decent rack, maybe a 9 or 10 pointer. It had been gutted, the cavity opened cleanly from sternum to pelvis, but not the way a hunter guts a deer. The organs were gone, removed completely, and the inside of the cavity was clean. Too clean. There was blood, sure, but not the mess you'd expect from a field dressing. It looked almost surgical. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the way the deer had been positioned. It was lying on its side, with its legs extended straight out, front and back, and its head turned at an angle that wasn't natural. The neck was bent wrong, twisted so the head faced almost directly backward, and the eyes were still open, staring at the trees above the clearing. The deer's tongue was hanging out, swollen and dark, and there was blood around its muzzle. I stood at the edge of the clearing, trying to process what I was seeing. My first thought was that someone had poached the deer and gutted it here, planning to come back for it later. But that didn't explain the position of the body, or the clean way it had been opened, or the complete absence of tracks anywhere in the clearing. I circled the area slowly, looking for boot prints, for drag marks, for any sign of human activity. There was nothing, just the buck, lying in that impossible position, staring at the sky with its dead eyes. I pulled out my phone and took a few pictures, not because I thought anyone would want to see them, but because I wanted documentation of what I'd found. Then I backed out of the clearing, worked my way through the laurel, and started hiking back to my truck. I didn't run, but I moved fast, and I didn't stop to check scrapes or look for more sign. I just wanted to be out of those woods. I called the state police from the trailhead and reported what I'd found, giving them the GPS coordinates and describing the location as best I could. They said they'd send a game warden out to check it, and they asked if I'd be willing to guide him to the spot. I said yes, even though I didn't want to go back there. 2 hours later, the warden showed up, along with the state trooper, and we hiked back in together. They took their own pictures, examined the clearing, looked at the drag mark, and asked me a bunch of questions about when I'd found it and whether I'd seen anyone else in the area. I told them everything I could remember. The warden spent a long time looking at the way the buck had been opened, running his gloved hand along the edge of the cut, and I could tell he was bothered by it even though he didn't say much. After about 30 minutes, they said they had what they needed, and we hiked back out together. The trooper told me on the way back that they'd probably send the buck to a lab for examination, just to rule out any wildlife diseases or unusual predation. He said there had been a few reports of strange animal behavior in the area over the past year, nothing they could pin down, but enough that they were keeping an eye on it. He asked me again if I planned to hunt there, and I told him I'd probably find a different spot for the rest of the season. I never heard anything official about what they found when they examined the deer. The news reported that the body of an adult male whitetail had been found in the Beartown area with evidence of unusual predation, and that wildlife officials were investigating. That was it. No follow-up, no explanation, no additional details. I hunted other areas for the rest of that season and the next one, staying away from the ridges near Beartown. I told people I was trying some new spots, that I wanted to mix things up and see different country. That was partly true, but mostly I just didn't want to be in those woods, again following a drag mark that shouldn't exist, finding something that had been opened and arranged by hands I couldn't see. About 2 years later, I was talking to another hunter at a sporting goods store in Princeton, and he mentioned he'd had a weird experience near Beartown, finding a deer carcass that had been gutted and positioned in a way that didn't make sense. He described it exactly the way I'd seen it. On its side, legs extended, head twisted back. When I asked when he'd found it, he said it had been about a month earlier. Different season, different year, but the same basic location, the same clearing or one very much like it. I didn't tell him about my own experience. I just listened, and when he was done, I suggested he might want to hunt somewhere else for a while. He looked at me like he was trying to figure out if I was serious, and then he said he'd already made that decision. He said the woods around that drainage didn't feel right anymore, hadn't felt right since he found that deer, and he wasn't interested in going back. I think about that conversation sometimes, and I think about the detective asking me if I plan to hunt there again. I think about the way the warden looked at that buck, and the way his expression changed when he examined the cut, and the fact that they never released any findings from whatever tests they ran. Mostly I think about the drag mark with no tracks around it, and the way that clearing felt when I stood at the edge of it, looking at something that should not have been arranged that way. There are a lot of good ridges in West Virginia, A lot of places where the deer move naturally and the sign makes sense, and nothing happens that doesn't have a reasonable explanation. I hunt those places now. And I don't go near Beartown anymore, not even to scout. Not even in the summer, when the sun is high and the woods are full of normal sounds. Because once you find something like that, once you see proof that something is in those mountains, doing things that don't fit any pattern you recognize, you can't unsee it. You just adjust your hunting plans accordingly. The first time I saw the figure, I didn't believe it was real. It was the third morning of a week-long hunt in the backcountry of the Cherokee National Forest, and I'd been glassing a clear cut from a ridgeline about half a mile away. I was looking for deer moving through the regrowth, checking the edges where the cut met the standing timber, when something caught my eye in the middle of the open area. At that distance, through 10-power binoculars, it looked like a person standing perfectly still, about 200 yards into the clear cut, just standing there in the open with no apparent purpose. I was hunting alone, camped about 3 miles back from the nearest forest road, in an area where I rarely saw other people even during peak season. The fact that someone else was out there wasn't impossible, but it seemed odd. The clear cut had been harvested 2 years earlier and was thick with briars and new growth, not the kind of place you just stand around in unless you were looking for something specific. I watched the figure for maybe 5 minutes, waiting to see if it would move or do something that would explain why it was there. It didn't move. It just stood, facing in my direction, though at that distance I couldn't tell if it was actually looking at me or just oriented that way by chance. I lowered the binoculars and tried to see the figure with my naked eye, but the distance was too great. All I could make out was a dark shape against the lighter green of the regrowth. I raised the binoculars again and took another look. Still there, still motionless. I scanned the area around it, looking for other people or any clue about what was going on, but the clear cut was otherwise empty. I told myself it was probably another hunter who'd spotted a deer and was waiting for a shot. That made sense. But something about the posture was wrong. The figure was too upright, too rigid, like someone standing at attention rather than someone in the middle of a hunt. And it had been standing there for at least 5 minutes, without any change in position, without any of the small movements people make when they're trying to stay still but not perfectly still. I kept watching. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The figure didn't move. I started considering the possibility that it wasn't a person at all, that maybe I was looking at a dead tree or a stump that my brain was interpreting as a human shape. That happens sometimes when you're glassing distant terrain. Your mind finds patterns that aren't really there. But I looked at this clear cut before, many times over the past few days, and I'd never noticed anything that looked like that. After about 20 minutes, the figure turned. It was a smooth, deliberate movement, rotating maybe 90 degrees to the left, and then it was still again. I felt my stomach drop. Whatever I was looking at, it definitely wasn't a tree. It was something that could move, something that had been standing there watching the ridgeline where I was positioned, and now it was looking in a different direction. I kept the binoculars on it for another 10 minutes. It didn't move again. Eventually, I had to lower the binoculars because my arms were getting tired, and I decided to approach the clear cut and see what was going on. If it was another hunter, I'd introduce myself and compare notes. If it was something else, I'd deal with it when I got closer. I marked the location on my GPS, packed my gear, and started working my way down the ridge toward the clear cut. It took about 40 minutes to cover the distance, navigating through the hardwoods and then dropping into the drainage that bordered the cut. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I stopped and glassed the interior again, looking for the figure. I couldn't find it. I scanned the entire clear cut methodically, checking every section, every spot where something could be standing or hiding. Nothing. The figure was gone. I entered the clear cut and walked to the area where I'd seen it standing, using my GPS to guide me. The ground there was soft, covered in a layer of fallen leaves and forest debris mixed with the new growth from the regrowth. I should have found tracks, especially if someone had been standing there for 20 minutes or more. There were no tracks, no boot prints, no disturbed leaves, no indication that anyone or anything had been standing in that spot recently. I circled the area, expanding my search radius, looking for any sign of passage. I found nothing. It was like the figure had materialized out of nowhere, stood in the clear cut for half an hour, and then vanished without leaving a trace. I stood there in the middle of the clearing, turning slowly, scanning the tree line and the surrounding terrain, trying to understand what I'd seen. I hiked back to my camp that evening and spent the night telling myself I'd been mistaken, that I'd probably seen a stump or a broken tree that my brain had misinterpreted from a distance. The turning movement had probably been a trick of the light or a shift in perspective as I moved the binoculars, or maybe just exhaustion playing games with my eyes after several days of hard hunting. I didn't sleep well, but I convinced myself by morning that there was a rational explanation. The second time I saw it, I knew I wasn't mistaken. It was 2 days later, late afternoon, and I was still hunting along a different ridgeline about a mile north of my camp. The sun was low, maybe an hour from setting, and I was working my way back toward camp when I saw the figure standing in the trees about 60 yards ahead of me, partially concealed behind a thick oak. This time there was no question about what I was looking at. It was man-shaped, roughly 6 feet tall, standing perfectly still behind the tree with just the left side of its body visible. But it wasn't a man. The proportions were wrong, the shoulders too narrow, the arms too long, and it was facing me, or at least oriented in my direction, though I couldn't see its face clearly because of the way it was positioned behind the tree. I froze. My rifle was already in my hands, and I brought it up slowly, putting the scope on the figure and trying to get a better look. Through the scope, at 4-power magnification, I could see more details. The surface was dark, mottled, somewhere between brown and gray. It might have been clothing, or it might have been skin or hair. I couldn't tell. What I could see clearly was that it wasn't moving at all. No breathing, no shifting of weight, no small adjustments of posture, just absolute stillness. I kept the scope on it for maybe 30 seconds, my finger resting on the trigger guard, my heart pounding hard enough that I could see the crosshairs shaking slightly with each beat. Then the figure moved. It didn't step out from behind the tree like a person would. It leaned, tilting its body to the right, bringing more of itself into view without moving its feet. The motion was smooth and wrong, like something bending at the waist but without the hip movement that should go with it. I could see its head now, or at least the shape of it, round and featureless at this distance, no details visible through the scope. It leaned further, and I realized it was looking around the tree at me, studying me the same way I was studying it. We stayed like that for maybe 5 seconds, both of us motionless, both of us watching the other. Then it pulled back behind the tree in the same smooth, wrong way, disappearing from view. I didn't move for at least a minute. I kept my rifle up, the scope trained on the tree, waiting to see if the figure would reappear. It didn't. Eventually, I lowered the rifle and started backing away, keeping my eyes on the tree, moving slowly and deliberately. I backed up about 20 yards, then turned and started walking back toward camp at a pace that was just short of running. I broke camp that night. I didn't wait for morning, didn't stick around to finish the last few days of my hunt. I packed everything by headlamp, loaded it all onto my pack frame, and hiked out to my truck in the dark. It took me almost 3 hours to cover the 3 miles to the forest road, stumbling over roots and rocks. But I didn't care. I just wanted to be out of those woods. I didn't report what I'd seen to anyone official. What would I say? That I'd seen a figure in the trees that didn't move like a person. That I'd watched something lean around a tree trunk in a way that didn't match human anatomy? There's no protocol for reporting something like that, and I knew how it would sound. I'd sound like someone who'd been alone in the woods too long and started seeing things. But I did talk to an older hunter I knew, a man who'd been hunting the Cherokee backcountry for 40 years, and who I trusted not to laugh at me. I described what I'd seen, and he listened without interrupting. When I was done, he asked me which drainage I'd been camping in. When I told him, he nodded slowly and said I should probably avoid that area for a while. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push, but the look on his face told me he'd heard stories about that part of the forest before. I asked him directly if he'd ever seen anything like what I described. He was quiet for a long moment, then said he'd seen things in those mountains that didn't fit his understanding of what lives there. He said he'd learned over the years that there are certain ridges and certain drainages where the rules are different, where you might encounter something that doesn't behave the way wildlife is supposed to behave. He said the smart thing to do when you find yourself in one of those places is to leave and not come back. I asked him what he thought it was, what I'd seen in the clear cut and behind the tree. He said he didn't know, and he didn't think knowing would help. He said whatever it was, it had been there long before we started hunting these mountains, and it would be there long after we stopped. He said the best thing to do was give it space and find somewhere else to hunt. I followed that advice. I still hunt the Cherokee, but I stay away from that particular drainage and the ridges around it. I hunt areas that see more traffic, places where I'm likely to run into other hunters or hikers, places that feel normal. I tell people I prefer hunting closer to the roads now, that I'm getting older and don't want to pack into the backcountry like I used to. That's partly true, but the real reason is I don't want to see that figure again, standing in a clear cut or leaning around a tree, watching me with a patience and stillness that nothing living should possess. Sometimes at night, when I'm lying in bed trying to sleep, I think about the way it moved. That smooth, wrong motion, bending at angles that didn't make sense, studying me from behind the tree. I think about how it vanished from the clear cut without leaving tracks, and how it knew exactly where I was on that ridgeline, even though I'd been motionless and downwind. Mostly I think about the fact that I'd probably walked past it a dozen times during that week without seeing it, and I wonder how many times it had stood in the trees watching me, waiting to see what I would do. I don't wonder anymore what it was. I took the older hunter's advice on that too. Knowing wouldn't help, and asking questions about something like that is a good way to end up back in those woods, looking for answers I don't actually want to find. There are things in the Appalachian backcountry that don't fit into the categories we use to organize the natural world. Things that have learned to exist in the spaces between our understanding and our experience. The smart thing to do when you encounter one of them is exactly what I did. Pack up, hike out, and find somewhere else to hunt. Because once you've seen something like that, once you've looked at it through a rifle scope and watched it look back at you, you realize that those mountains don't belong to us the way we like to think they do. We're just visitors, and some places don't want visitors at all. The elk season in Pennsylvania had been open for 3 days when I found the truck. I'd been hunting a remote section of state game lands in Elk County. working a series of ridges that saw very little pressure because of how far they were from the nearest access point. I'd drawn a tag for the first time in 6 years, and I'd scouted the area thoroughly over the summer, identifying several travel corridors and bedding areas that looked promising. The morning of the third day, I was hiking back to my truck after an unsuccessful morning hunt when I saw the other vehicle parked at an angle in the trees about 50 yards off the old logging road I'd been following. It was a newer model, pickup, maybe 2 or 3 years old, with Pennsylvania plates and a rifle case visible through the rear window. The truck was backed into a small clearing between 2 large hemlocks, positioned like someone had been trying to hide it from the road but hadn't done a particularly good job. The driver's side door was open. I work as a paramedic in State College, and I've seen enough accident scenes and medical emergencies to know when something doesn't look right. The open door bothered me immediately. It was cold that morning, mid-20s, and nobody would leave their door hanging open unless they had left the truck in a hurry or something had prevented them from closing it. I approached slowly, calling out to see if anyone was nearby. Nobody answered. When I got closer, I could see that the truck was empty. The keys were still in the ignition, and the rifle case in the back seat was unzipped and empty. There was a day pack on the passenger seat, partially open with what looked like energy bars and a water bottle visible inside. A GPS unit was mounted on the dashboard, turned off. Everything about the scene suggested someone had parked here, grabbed their rifle, and headed into the woods to hunt. But the open door suggested something else, something that had happened quickly or unexpectedly. I walked around the truck, looking for any other clues. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing that indicated violence or an accident. The ground around the vehicle showed boot prints heading into the woods on the far side of the clearing, fresh tracks in the thin layer of snow that had fallen the previous evening. I followed the tracks with my eyes as far as I could see them, watching them lead up the slope into thick timber. I pulled out my phone to call it in, then realized I didn't have service. That wasn't unusual in this part of the state. The terrain was too rugged, the cell towers too sparse. I'd have to hike back to my truck and drive until I found a signal, which would take at least an hour. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. The tracks were fresh, probably made that morning. If someone was hurt or lost in the woods nearby, an hour could matter. I decided to follow the tracks for a short distance, just to see if I could find any indication of what had happened. I shouldered my rifle and started up the slope, moving carefully, calling out every 30 or 40 yards to see if anyone would respond. The tracks were clear in the snow, a single set of boot prints heading steadily uphill through the hemlocks. The stride looked normal, not hurried or erratic. Whoever had made them had been walking with purpose, not running or stumbling. I followed the tracks for maybe 200 yards before they reached the top of the slope and started down the far side into a drainage. That's where things changed. The tracks became irregular, the stride shortening, the prints deeper in the snow, like the person had been digging in or bracing themselves. Then about halfway down the slope, the tracks stopped. They didn't end at a tree or a rock or any feature that would explain why someone would stop moving. They just stopped right in the middle of the slope, in an open area with nothing around them. The last print was a left boot, clear and deep in the snow. After that, nothing. No continuing tracks. No sign of the person turning around or changing direction. No indication of where they'd gone. I stood there staring at the last print, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I circled the area carefully, looking for any tracks I might have missed. any sign of which direction the person had gone after that last step. There was nothing. The snow beyond that point was undisturbed, smooth and unmarked, except for the tracks of small animals and birds. I expanded my search, walking in increasingly wide circles around the last print, scanning the ground and the surrounding trees for any clue. I found nothing. It was like the person had taken one last step and then simply ceased to exist. After about 20 minutes of searching, I gave up and hiked back to the truck. The vehicle was still sitting there with the door open, exactly as I'd found it. I grabbed a flashlight from my pack and looked inside more carefully, checking the glove compartment and the center console for any identification or information about the owner. I found the registration in the glove box. The truck belonged to someone from Altoona, a man with a common last name that I didn't recognize. There was nothing else in the vehicle that told me anything useful. I closed the door, marked the location on my GPS, and hiked back to my own truck. It took me 40 minutes to reach an area with cell service, and I called the Pennsylvania Game Commission to report what I'd found. They took down all the information and said they'd send a warden out to check on it. They asked if I'd be willing to guide the warden to the location, and I said yes. 2 hours later, I met the warden at the nearest parking area and led him back to the abandoned truck. He examined the vehicle, took photos, and asked me to show him where the tracks ended. We hiked up the slope together, following the same route I'd taken earlier, and when we reached the spot where the prints stopped, he spent a long time studying the ground and the surrounding area. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was bothered by it. After about 30 minutes of searching, he asked me if I'd seen or heard anything unusual while I'd been hunting in the area over the past few days. I told him I hadn't, that everything had seemed normal. He nodded, then asked if I planned to continue hunting here. I said I'd probably move to a different section of the game lands. He said that was a good idea. We hiked back to the truck, and he told me the Game Commission would handle it from there. He said they'd bring in a search and rescue team to look for the missing hunter, and they'd try to contact the owner of the vehicle to find out what had happened. He thanked me for reporting it and asked me to call if I saw or heard anything else unusual. I said I would. I never heard what happened with the search. The news reported that a hunter had been reported missing in Elk County and that search teams were working the area. But after a few days, the story disappeared from the media. I tried searching online for updates, but found nothing. About 3 weeks later, I called the Game Commission office and asked if they'd found the missing hunter. The person I spoke with said the case was still under investigation, and they couldn't provide any details. I finished out my elk season hunting a different section of game lands about 20 miles away. I told myself I was just trying a new area, that I wanted to see different country and maybe find better elk activity. That was partly true, but mostly I didn't want to be anywhere near that drainage where the tracks had stopped in the middle of the slope with no explanation. The following summer, I was talking to another hunter I knew from State College, someone who'd been hunting elk in Pennsylvania for 20 years. I mentioned the incident casually, not giving too many details, just saying I'd found an abandoned truck and some strange tracks. He asked me where, and when I told him the general area, he got quiet for a moment. Then he said there had been 2 other incidents in that same section of gamelands over the past 10 years, both involving hunters who'd gone into the woods and never come out. He said the first one had happened about 8 years earlier during rifle season. A hunter had been dropped off by a friend at a trailhead with plans to meet back at the same spot 6 hours later. He never showed up. Search teams found no trace of him, no tracks, no gear, nothing. The second incident was about 4 years ago, also during hunting season. A hunter's truck had been found abandoned with the door open and the keys in the ignition. Almost exactly like what I described. That hunter was never found either. I asked him if the Game Commission had ever determined what happened. He said the official explanation for both cases was that the hunters had gotten disoriented, wandered off course, and succumbed to exposure or injury in terrain too rugged for searchers to cover completely. He said that explanation never sat right with him, especially given how experienced both hunters were and how well they knew the area. But he said there wasn't any evidence to suggest anything else, so the cases remained open and unsolved. I asked him if he still hunted that section of game lands. He said he used to, but he stopped after the second incident. He said the woods there didn't feel right anymore, hadn't felt right for years. He said he couldn't explain it better than that, just that something about the terrain and the way sound carried and the way the shadows fell made him uncomfortable. He said there were plenty of other places to hunt elk, places where he didn't have that feeling. I haven't been back to that area since I found the truck. I drew another elk tag 2 years later and hunted a completely different part of the state, up near the New York border. I had a successful hunt that time, took a nice spike bull, and I never once felt the unease I'd felt in those woods near the drainage where the tracks stopped. Sometimes I think about the boot print I saw, that last clear impression in the snow with nothing beyond it. I think about how the person who made it must have taken one more step and found themselves somewhere else, or found nothing at all, just an absence where the ground should have been. I think about the other hunters who disappeared in that same area, and I wonder if they saw something or felt something in the moment before they vanished. Some indication that the terrain around them had changed in a way they couldn't perceive. Mostly, I think about the warden's question, whether I'd seen or heard anything unusual in the area. At the time I said no, but that wasn't entirely true. There had been something, a quality to the silence in those woods that I'd noticed but dismissed. It wasn't the normal quiet of a forest in winter. It was heavier than that, more complete, like the absence of sound rather than just the lack of it. I'd felt it while I was following the tracks up the slope, and I'd felt it even more strongly when I stood at the place where they ended. But I hadn't mentioned it to the warden because I couldn't explain it in a way that would make sense. I can't explain it now either. Not in any way that would satisfy someone looking for a rational explanation. All I know is that there are sections of Pennsylvania game lands where the woods feel wrong, where experienced hunters disappear without a trace, and where boot prints end in the middle of snow-covered slopes with no indication of where the person went next. And I know that once you find one of those places, the smart thing to do is mark it on your map, tell other people to avoid it, and find somewhere else to hunt. Because whatever's happening in those woods doesn't follow rules that make sense to us. And asking too many questions about it is a good way to end up as another set of tracks that stops in the middle of nowhere. Another case file marked unsolved. Another name added to the list of hunters who went into the Pennsylvania mountains and never came out. The cabin belonged to my uncle, and I'd been hunting from it every November for close to 15 years. It sat at the end of a long gravel road in the Daniel Boone National Forest, about 8 miles from the nearest paved highway, surrounded by ridges and hollows that held good populations of deer and hadn't changed much since my grandfather's time. The cabin itself was simple. One room with a wood stove, a couple of bunks, a table, and a small kitchen area with a propane stove and a hand pump for water. No electricity, no phone service, no internet. Just a place to sleep and eat between hunts. I worked as a long-haul trucker out of Lexington, running routes that took me across most of the eastern United States, which meant my schedule was unpredictable and my time off was precious. I'd arranged to have the first 2 weeks of November free specifically so I could spend them at the cabin during the best part of the rut. I drove down on a Friday evening, loaded with enough food and supplies to last the full 2 weeks, planning to settle in and hunt hard without having to drive back to town for anything. The first week went well. I saw plenty of deer, shot a decent 8-pointer on the 4th morning, and spent the rest of the week enjoying the solitude and the routine of hunting from a place I knew intimately. I'd been coming to this cabin since I was in my 20s, and I knew every ridge and hollow within 5 miles of it. I knew where the deer crossed the creek, where they bedded during the day, which saddles they used to move between feeding areas. The place made sense to me in a way that few places do. The incident happened during the 2nd week, on a Wednesday night. I'd returned to the cabin around dusk after an evening hunt, cold and tired, looking forward to getting the stove going and heating up some stew I'd made a few days earlier. I parked my truck next to the cabin, grabbed my rifle and pack, and walked to the door. That's when I noticed it was open. Not wide open, just cracked a few inches, enough that I could see darkness inside instead of the door being flush with the frame. I stopped walking and stood there for a moment, trying to remember if I'd closed it properly when I left that morning. I was almost certain I had. I always closed it, always made sure the latch caught. Bears were common in the area, and an open door was an invitation for one to come inside and tear the place apart looking for food. I pushed the door open slowly and reached for the flashlight on my belt. The cabin's interior was dark, and I couldn't see much beyond the first few feet. I called out, asking if anyone was there, half expecting to find another hunter who'd needed shelter or who'd thought the cabin was abandoned. Nobody answered. I stepped inside and swept the flashlight across the room. Everything looked normal at first. My gear was where I'd left it, hanging on pegs near the door. The wood stove was cold, which was expected. The bunks were undisturbed, but then I noticed the smell. It was faint but distinctive. Something organic and wrong, like spoiled meat, mixed with damp earth. I'd smelled plenty of dead animals in the woods over the years, and this was similar but not quite the same. It had a quality I couldn't identify, something that made my stomach tighten. I checked the cabin thoroughly, looking in every corner, under the bunks, in the small closet where I stored dry goods. Everything was in its place. Nothing had been moved or disturbed. The smell seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, just hanging in the air without an obvious source. I opened all the windows to let it air out and started a fire in the stove, thinking maybe the cabin just needed some heat and circulation. While the fire was building, I went outside to check around the cabin for any sign of what might have opened the door. I found tracks in the soft dirt near the front step. Boot prints, roughly my size, leading from the woods to the door and then back again. They looked fresh, probably made within the past few hours, but there was something strange about them. The depth was inconsistent. Some prints were deep, like someone heavy had made them. Others were shallow, barely visible. And the stride was wrong, too long in some places and too short in others, like the person walking had been drunk or injured. I followed the tracks back toward the tree line, keeping my flashlight trained on them, my rifle in my other hand. The prints led about 30 yards into the woods and then stopped at the base of a large oak tree. Just stopped, the same way the tracks had stopped in Pennsylvania. No indication of where the person had gone from there, no continuing footprints, nothing. I stood at the tree for a long moment, shining my light up into the branches and around the surrounding area, trying to find some explanation. There wasn't one. I went back to the cabin, closed and locked the door, and tried to convince myself that someone had been snooping around, maybe looking to see if the place was occupied or checking if there was anything worth stealing. The boot prints could have been made by someone with an uneven gait. The smell could have been a dead animal under the cabin or in the crawl space. The open door could have been the wind, though I knew the latch was too secure for that. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up to small sounds, the cabin settling, the fire popping, branches scraping against the roof. Each time I woke, I'd lie there in the dark, listening, trying to determine if any of the sounds were different from the normal night sounds of the cabin. Around 3 a.m, I woke to absolute silence. No wind, no insects, no distant owls. Just complete, total silence that felt heavy and wrong. I sat up in the bunk and listened harder, straining to hear anything. The silence continued for maybe 2 minutes, and then I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin, moving from the front to the side to the back. I grabbed my rifle and my flashlight and moved to the window, trying to see out without making myself visible. The moon was bright enough that I could see the area around the cabin fairly clearly, but I didn't see anyone moving out there. The footsteps continued, completing a full circle around the cabin and then starting another one. I could hear them clearly, the crunch of gravel and leaves, the steady rhythm of someone walking, but I couldn't see anyone. I moved to a different window, then another, trying to get a view of whoever or whatever was out there. Every time I looked, I saw nothing. Just the empty woods and the moonlit clearing around the cabin. The footsteps completed a second circle and stopped at the front door. I heard the door handle rattle, heard something testing the lock. The door held. Then I heard knocking, 3 slow, heavy knocks that made the entire door shake in its frame. I stood frozen in the middle of the cabin, my rifle pointed at the door, my finger on the trigger guard, my heart hammering so hard I thought whoever was outside must be able to hear it. The knocking stopped. The silence returned, even heavier than before. I waited, watching the door, waiting for it to burst open or for the windows to shatter or for something to force its way inside. Nothing happened. After about 5 minutes, I heard the footsteps again, moving away from the door, heading back into the woods. I listened to them fade into the distance, and then the normal night sounds gradually returned. Wind in the trees, an owl calling from somewhere down the hollow, the usual creaks and groans of the cabin. I didn't go back to sleep. I sat at the table with my rifle across my lap and waited for dawn. When first light finally came, I went outside and checked the area around the cabin. The boot prints from the previous evening were still there, leading from the woods to the door and back. But now there were more prints, dozens of them, circling the cabin multiple times, all with the same inconsistent depth and wrong stride. They went around the cabin at least 10 times, maybe more, overlapping and crossing each other in a way that made it impossible to count them accurately. I followed one set back into the woods and found them ending at the same oak tree where the first set had stopped. I followed another set and found them ending at a different tree about 50 yards away. I followed a third set and found them ending in the middle of a small clearing with no trees or rocks or features nearby, just an empty space where the tracks simply ceased to exist. I went back to the cabin, loaded all my gear into the truck, and left. I didn't bother with breakfast or cleaning up or doing any of the usual end-of-trip tasks. I just wanted to be out of there. I drove the 8 miles of gravel road faster than I should have, not slowing down until I hit the paved highway and had some distance between myself and that hollow. I called my uncle that evening and told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, and when I was done, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked me if I'd heard the stories about that cabin. I said I hadn't, that nobody had ever mentioned anything unusual about the place. He said that's because most people didn't know, that it was family knowledge that didn't get shared outside the family. And even within the family, it wasn't talked about much. He said his father, my grandfather, had built the cabin in the 50s and had hunted from it for almost 20 years without incident. Then in the 70s, something started happening. My grandfather would come back from hunts and mention that the cabin door had been open when he arrived, or that he'd heard footsteps outside at night, or that he'd found tracks that didn't make sense. He'd shrugged it off at first, attributing it to other hunters or local kids messing around. But then one November, my grandfather had been at the cabin alone when something walked circles around the place all night, knocking on the door and rattling the windows. He'd stayed inside with his shotgun and waited it out, and in the morning he found the same kind of tracks I described. Dozens of boot prints circling the cabin and leading off into the woods, where they ended at random spots. He'd driven out that morning and refused to spend another night there alone. He'd only gone back with other people after that, and only during the day. My uncle said that every few years, someone in the family would stay at the cabin and experience something similar. Never exactly the same, but always involving footsteps outside, tracks that didn't make sense, and doors that wouldn't stay closed. He said he'd experienced it himself once in the 90s, and that's why he'd stopped using the cabin for overnight stays. He only went there during the day now, and he always made sure to leave before dark. I asked him why nobody had told me any of this before I started using the cabin. He said it was a family tradition not to talk about it unless someone specifically asked. He said they figured each person had to decide for themselves whether the hunting was good enough to put up with whatever else came with the place. He said most people decided it wasn't. I asked him what he thought it was, what walked around the cabin at night making impossible footprints. He said he didn't know and didn't particularly want to find out. He said his father had a theory that the cabin was built on some kind of old trail or pathway that something still used, something that resented the structure being there and made its displeasure known. But that was just speculation, just an old man's attempt to explain something that didn't fit into any category he recognized. I haven't been back to the cabin since that night. My uncle still owns it, and other family members still use it occasionally for day hunts. But as far as I know, nobody spent the night there in years. I hunt other areas now, public land closer to Lexington, where I can drive in and out each day without having to stay overnight. I tell people I'm getting too old for the backcountry camping, that I prefer the convenience of sleeping in my own bed. That's partly true, but the real reason is I don't want to be in that cabin again when the sun goes down, listening to footsteps circle the walls, hearing someone or something test the door and knock 3 times and then walk away into the woods. I don't want to find boot prints in the morning that lead from everywhere and nowhere, ending at trees and rocks and empty clearings like whoever made them just stepped out of the world. My grandfather spent 20 years hunting from that cabin before something changed, and he had to alter his routine. I spent 15 years there before I encountered the same thing. That's longer than most people get, and I consider myself lucky for it. But that luck has run out, and I'm not interested in pushing it further. There are too many good places to hunt in Kentucky, too many ridges and hollows where the deer move naturally, and the only footsteps you hear at night are your own. To waste time in a place where something walks in circles around your cabin and leaves tracks that defy explanation. The cabin is still there, sitting at the end of that gravel road. and it probably will be for another 50 years or more. The family won't sell it, and nobody's likely to tear it down. It's part of our history now, part of the stories we tell ourselves about the mountains and the things that live in them. Maybe someday, someone else will decide to spend a night there and see what happens. But it won't be me. I've already seen enough. The guide service I was working for operated out of a small town in northern Maine, running week-long bear hunts during September and October. I'd signed on for the season as a backup guide, helping with baiting runs and equipment maintenance, working toward getting my own territory the following year. Most of the actual guiding was done by guys who'd been with the outfit for years, who knew the areas and the bear populations and had established relationships with clients. My job was mostly support, checking bait sites, maintaining tree stands, helping clients process their bears, and generally doing whatever needed to be done to keep the operation running smoothly. The incident happened during my third week with the service. One of the primary guides had to leave unexpectedly, family emergency, and they asked me to take his client out for the last 3 days of the hunt. The client was a guy from Pennsylvania, mid-40s, who'd been coming to the service for years and had taken several bears with them before. He knew what he was doing, knew how to handle himself in the woods, and wasn't the type to need hand-holding. The guide I was replacing told me the client would be easy to work with, that I just needed to get him to the stand and pick him up afterward, and that the bait site he'd been hunting was active with a good bear showing up regularly on camera. The bait site was about 12 miles from the main camp, accessed by a combination of logging roads and a short hike through thick forest. The stand was set up in a large spruce tree overlooking a clearing where we'd been running bait for the past month. Trail cameras showed a mature male bear hitting the site almost every evening around dusk, right when the light was perfect for a shot. It looked like a textbook setup. I drove the client out on a Wednesday afternoon, arriving at the trailhead with about 2 hours before prime time. We hiked to the stand together, and I helped him get settled in. I went over the shooting lanes, showed him where the bear typically approached from, and reviewed the plan for pickup. I'd return at full dark, about 2 hours after sunset, and meet him at the base of the tree. He'd text me when he was ready to come down, or when he'd taken a shot, whichever came first. I confirmed he had his phone, his safety harness was secure, and he had everything he needed. He said he was good to go. I hiked back to the truck and drove to a spot about 3 miles away where I had cell service. That was part of the routine. The guides would drop off clients and then retreat to areas where they could stay in contact, ready to return when needed. I parked at a pull-off overlooking a valley and settled in to wait, catching up on messages and killing time until I got the text. The text came about 40 minutes later. "Bear down, good shot, not going anywhere." I texted back confirming I was on my way and drove back to the trailhead. By the time I parked and started hiking in, the sun was setting and the woods were getting dark. I used my headlamp once I hit the trail, moving quickly but carefully, excited to see the bear and help the client get it back to the truck. When I reached the clearing, I found the stand empty. The client wasn't in the tree, wasn't at the base, wasn't anywhere I could see. I called out his name and got no response. I checked the area around the tree carefully, looking for any sign of him, and that's when I found the blood. It wasn't a lot, just a few drops on the leaves near the base of the tree, but it was definitely blood. Fresh blood, still wet. I followed the trail with my headlamp, seeing more drops leading away from the tree toward the far side of the clearing. Then the blood trail just stopped, about 30 feet from the tree in the middle of open ground. No body, no drag marks, no additional blood beyond that point. Just a trail that ended for no reason. I called out again, louder this time, scanning the woods with my light. Nothing. I pulled out my phone and called the client's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I tried again with the same result. I stood in the clearing, trying to understand what I was looking at, trying to come up with a scenario that made sense. The client had texted me 40 minutes earlier, saying he'd taken a bear. He'd said the bear was down and not going anywhere, which meant it was a solid hit. But there was no bear in the clearing, no blood trail leading away from the bait site, no sign of an animal being dragged or moved. The only blood was near the tree where the client should have been waiting for me, and that trail ended inexplicably in open ground. I started searching the woods around the clearing, calling the client's name every few minutes, checking my phone constantly to see if he'd texted or called. Nothing. I worked outward in expanding circles, looking for any sign of him, any indication of where he'd gone. After about 30 minutes, I found his rifle leaning against a tree about 40 yards from the clearing, just standing there propped against the trunk like someone had carefully placed it. That's when I started to panic. A hunter doesn't set his rifle down carefully like that if he's tracking a wounded bear or chasing after an animal. He carries it with him, keeps it ready in case he needs a follow-up shot. The only reason to set it down is if you need both hands for something, and you plan to come right back for it. But the client hadn't come back for it. The rifle had been sitting there, long enough that the barrel was cold to the touch. I grabbed the rifle and kept searching, moving faster now, less careful, just trying to cover ground and find the client. I found his hat about 50 yards past where the rifle had been, lying on top of a fallen log. Then I found one of his gloves 20 yards beyond that, just sitting on a rock. Each item was placed, not dropped, set down deliberately like someone leaving a trail. I followed the items for another 100 yards, finding a flashlight, his backpack, and finally his safety harness. All of them positioned on prominent features, like someone wanted them to be found. The trail of items led me to the edge of a steep ravine, heavily overgrown with spruce and fir, thick enough that I couldn't see the bottom. I stopped at the edge and called down into the darkness. No response. I called the main office and explained the situation. They told me to stay where I was and wait, that they were sending everyone they could spare and contacting local search and rescue. I waited at the edge of the ravine for about an hour until the first truck arrived, and then spent the rest of the night helping guide search teams through the area, showing them where I'd found each item and where the blood trail had stopped. Search and rescue brought in dogs the next morning. The dogs picked up the client's scent at the clearing and followed it to each item I'd found, but at the ravine they lost it. They worked the area for hours, checking the bottom of the ravine and all the terrain around it, and found nothing. No more blood, no tracks, no scent trail continuing beyond that point. One of the handlers told me privately that the dogs were acting strange, that they were confused and reluctant to work the ravine area, which was unusual for experienced search dogs. The search continued for 3 days. They brought in helicopters with thermal imaging, more dog teams, dozens of volunteers who walked grid patterns through the woods. They found nothing beyond what I'd already found. The blood trail that stopped for no reason. The items placed carefully in a line leading to the ravine, and the ravine itself empty of any sign of the client. On the 4th day, they found his phone. It was sitting on a rock near the bait site, about 10 feet from where the blood trail ended. Nobody had seen it there during the initial search, which didn't make sense because we'd all gone over that area multiple times. One of the state police investigators picked it up and checked the call log. The last outgoing text was the one I'd received saying the bear was down. But there were other texts that had been sent after that, messages that didn't make it out because there was no service at the bait site. The investigator showed me the unsent texts. There were 5 of them, all composed in the span of about 10 minutes, all time-stamped after the text I'd received. The first one said, "Something's wrong with the bear." The second said, "It's not moving right." The third was just, "Did you hear that?" The fourth said, "There's someone else here." The last one, composed 6 minutes after the first, said, "It's not a bear." The investigator asked me if I knew what any of that meant. I said I didn't. He asked if anyone else had been scheduled to hunt that area. I said no, that the bait sites were carefully managed to prevent exactly that kind of conflict. That only one client per site, and everyone knew where everyone else was. He made notes and said they'd keep investigating. They never found the client. The case remained open for about 6 months, and then it was quietly moved to an inactive status. The official conclusion was that the client had likely wounded a bear, pursued it into rough terrain, fallen into the ravine, and become injured in a way that prevented him from calling for help. They theorized that he'd succumbed to his injuries somewhere in the dense undergrowth at the bottom of the ravine, where the search dogs and teams couldn't locate him. They couldn't explain the items left in a trail or the text messages that didn't send, but they said those could be explained by confusion or disorientation following a fall. I quit the guide service 2 days after they called off the active search. I told them I was going back to my regular job, that guiding wasn't for me, that I'd realized I preferred steadier work. That was partly true, but the real reason was I couldn't stop thinking about those unsent texts, especially the last one. It's not a bear. I'd seen the trail camera photos from that bait site. I'd watched hours of footage showing a bear hitting it regularly. A big mature male that looked like a perfectly normal black bear doing perfectly normal bear things. But the client had texted that something was wrong with it, that it wasn't moving right, and then he'd said it wasn't a bear at all. And whatever he saw or understood in those few minutes before he stopped texting had caused him to leave his stand, set down his rifle, leave a trail of his gear through the woods, and disappear at the edge of a ravine without a trace. The guide service closed down after that season. The owner said it was for personal reasons, that he'd been planning to retire anyway, but everyone knew it was because of what had happened. You can't run a business where clients vanish into the woods under circumstances nobody can explain. The insurance alone would have been impossible to manage. I moved back to my hometown in Massachusetts and got my old job back working construction. I haven't been hunting since. People ask me why, and I tell them I lost interest, that I'm too busy with work and family obligations. But the truth is, I can't walk into thick woods anymore without thinking about that clearing, that blood trail that stopped for no reason, those carefully placed items leading to a ravine where dogs wouldn't search and a man simply ceased to exist. And I think about the bear that showed up on the trail cameras week after week, right on schedule, looking exactly like a bear is supposed to look. I think about how something can appear normal through a camera lens and even through binoculars from a tree stand, but when you see it up close, when it's directly below you in failing light, you might realize it's not what you thought it was. You might realize it's not moving the way it should, that something about it is fundamentally wrong. And by the time you understand that, by the time you send a text message trying to explain what you're seeing, it might be too late to do anything except leave your gear behind as markers for whoever comes looking. The trail cameras from that site were collected as evidence and never returned. But I talked to one of the other guides who saw the footage from the days following the client's disappearance. He said the bear kept showing up on schedule every evening around dusk, feeding on the bait like always. But in the last clip, dated about a week after the search was called off, The bear walked up to the camera and looked directly into it. He said it stayed there for almost 30 seconds, just staring into the lens, and that there was something about its face that wasn't right. Something about the eyes that didn't reflect light the way they should. He said after that clip, the bear never showed up on the cameras again. The bait site just went dead, no activity at all, like whatever had been using it had finished what it came there to do and moved on to somewhere else.